Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Slip Safety Show. I'm Christian Harris and I'm the host of the show and the founder of Slip Safety Services. My guest today is Richard Bowman. He hails from Melbourne in Australia, but as you'll hear, he works all over the world and he's an undoubted expert in the field of slip resistance. Starting in the tile world, as he'll tell us, he developed himself and became very much involved in the kind of global discussions around slips, trips and falls. He's also involved in the International Ergonomics Association and the Spanish Slip Resistance Group, in addition to being a member, like me, of the UK Slip Resistance Group. So this one gets not too technical, but a little bit technical in terms of the world of slips, trips and falls. We're planning to have a further episode where we get even a bit more technical, shall we say, with Richard. So this is kind of headline level stuff. So thinking about, what are some of the problems around this issue of perception of slips, trips and falls? What can we do to try to agree some sort of international harmonisation of how we test, and some other topics like that. As always, if you find this content valuable, we'd really appreciate if you could introduce it to other people, and please do give us a subscribe on whichever platform you are consuming this. That would be useful for you because you'll get to know when episodes are released, and it would also be very useful for us, so that would be fantastic if you could do that. So with that, let's get into our chat with Richard Bowman, and don't be fooled by his background. He's not in the Caribbean, he is in or near Melbourne in Australia. Hope you enjoy today's show. Richard Bowman, welcome to the Slip Safety Show.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a nice glamorous background there. It must be very sunny in Australia.
It is, particularly at this time of night.
Exactly. Which, are you near Melbourne, is that right?
I'm in Melbourne, yeah.
Oh, lovely.
Quite close to the beach.
Okay, sort of St Kilda's way, or?
St Kilda's just a little bit to the north.
Yeah. I had a really nice dinner there a few years ago in a place called Donovan's.
Right, it's closed at the moment, but
yes.
Hopefully open again.
Yes, fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Do you want to just give the audience a bit of an overview of who you are and what you do, and then we'll get into our chat?
Certainly. By qualification, I'm a ceramic engineer or material scientist. I've had a long research career at Australia's premier governmental research organisation, the CSIRO, and was responsible for matters relating to traditional ceramics, particularly ceramic tiles, differential movement of tiles and bricks, tiling systems, and then about 35 years ago I established the slip resistance laboratories and got into the world of slip resistance. So nowadays I'm working for myself for the last 15 years, and we would be a specialist tiling system and slip resistance consultancy, looking at those two areas. So I have many different types of work that I undertake, but a lot of it would be expert witness work and some quite interesting work at times that I'm never allowed to talk about.
No, exactly. Is it, out of interest, how is society over there in terms of the level of litigiousness, if that's the right word? Obviously, America has this reputation of being, very litigious, and Ireland has a fairly large problem. How does Australia sit on that scale?
There has been quite a bit of litigation. It's probably dropped down a fair bit because of the changes in the law and things like that, but people have the right to sue and quite often will do so, and so there is quite a bit of litigious action, it'll generally settle before it goes to court, but not always.
Yeah.
So I do a little bit of work in that area in Australia, Singapore and other places.
Okay, jetting around and travelling a bit as well. Nice.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, I had a conversation with a guy who used to be, he used to head up sort of insurance and claims and risk management for, I think it was Woolworths. Is Woolworths one of the big supermarkets there?
Yes, Woolworths is quite large. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So he was giving me a bit of an overview from his perspective as well. So interesting. But the health and safety law, as I understand it, in Australia, kind of has some similarities to the UK. Is that right?
It would be very similar.
Hmm.
We have an expectation that any workplace is going to be safe, and most of the jurisdictions will be using the pendulum for those measurements. Certainly when the floor's wet.
Yeah, yeah. Because you don't they use a different test in the dry sometimes? Is that right?
The tortoise is sometimes used in the dry. It's something I don't normally use myself. I find it to be a useful device for trying to identify areas of the floor that may have less slip resistance than others. But the general principle, I don't think, is very reliable in giving you quantifiable results.
Yeah. And you've been quite involved, I think, if I'm right in saying, over the years in kind of lots of these international groups where there's been a long potted history of trying to agree something around which test methods to use and where and so on. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I've been very much involved in ISO TC 189 ceramic tiles since it started up in 1986, 87. And we thought that we may have come to an agreement as to which test methods we might use although back in 1992 we were at the Omni Hotel in Miami, and Frank Rowland from the Health and Safety Executive turned up and said, "No, I'm sorry, I've got the British vote on this, and you're not doing this and whatever." So we still haven't got a standard since then. There've been lots of deliberations, and at the moment we are waiting on the SEN TC 339 to try and finalise their standard. So some people hope that that will become the basis of the ISO standard. I think it's still got a little way to go, and there's going to be more political shenanigans. But that's the world of standards.
Yeah, yeah. It's very difficult because I think you know much more about this than me. I'm much more confined to the UK, but as I understand it, you know, the fact that we've got the HSE as quite a strong force as government, a part of government, is a bit different than, shall we say, than other countries like America, for example. I don't think they even have any recognised test across the country, never mind something that they can work internationally over.
Yeah, they do have in the ceramic tile industry a standard that they've developed on the basis of the BOT 3000, which used to be the Selmayr or FSC 2000. They have got rid of their static methods, just about all of them by now. But they do still have the broom grabber and other devices that people are very fond of. So, yeah, but there's a great difficulty with their litigation in that everybody's using different methods of test. But certainly where the manufacturer is claiming this is the result when it's new, gives a starting point. However, the degree to which the slip resistance of a lot of materials changes is really should be of concern to everybody, because what we want is the basis of the European expectation as put out in 1989 in the directive that all floor surfaces should be safe at the end of an economically reasonable life cycle.
Mm.
So that's been my focus for quite a few years now, try and ensure that things are going to be safe at the end of a reasonably economical life cycle.
Mm. And that's one of the advantages of tiles, I suppose, over some other types of floors that are more prone to wearing more quickly.
Well, ceramic tiles may not show the wear, but their surface characteristics can change quite dramatically.
Mm.
I may show you a few slides later on just to emphasize how rapidly they initially change. I mean, slip resistance can change due to their cleanliness as well, but that's an area that we may not get into today. But the way in which wear can change the surface is generally going to lead to a loss of slip resistance, and we need to know the likely end point. And I believe that that's the basis that specifications should be on.
Mm.
So for any given situation, we might say, well, this is an area where we should have a minimum of 30 BPN or whatever we want to decide on. And you can then have a look at the types of products that are going to give you that.
Mm.
But you've got to be looking at the cleanability of the floor surface, and you've got to be able to identify what's going to be compatible with the owner's expectations. So there's lots of things that need to be done, rather than just taking an ex-factory slip resistance value and assuming that if you get 3 values of 45, that they are all equivalent, because some of them are going to lose slip resistance far quicker than others, and some are going to be almost impossible to clean. So the focus just on achieving a number is so short-sighted.
It's something that we're seeing a lot here. I mean, when I started in the industry sort of 10 odd years ago, very few of the architects had even heard of the pendulum. You know, they were still speaking about R ratings and ABC ratings and so on and so forth, whereas now it's much, much more common that people are using pendulum test values. But what we're seeing is that they're kind of going overboard and over specifying, as you say. So, you know, they're saying, oh, we want it to be 36 plus, so we'll put in something that's 55 plus in the wet. But then, as you identify, that introduces a huge cleaning issue, and then there's a lack of dialogue between the specifier, the building owner, and the cleaning company, and everything gets messed up. And quite rapidly, that floor that started life as a 55 PTV in the wet can be 30 or lower, because of the fact that it can't be cleaned very well, or it can be cleaned, but you know, the way that it's being cleaned and the commercial model of the cleaning and all these other factors aren't robust enough to maintain the surface.
Yes, I think that we're going to have difficulties in that some materials we can probably have fairly reliable accelerated wear conditioning methods that will give us a reasonable indication of the long-term slip resistance, whereas with other materials, concretes, that may have surface skin effects and things like that, and they can wear quite differently. Bricks, in some instances, are going to wear differently, and we know from past experience that if we have some materials and they're exposed to acid rain, they're going to wear or weather quite differently. So it's a matter of using our best common sense. It always strikes me as being a little bit short-sighted that we can have a system that is far from perfect, and yet when we replace it, everybody expects that we're going to have a perfect system. So we've got to accept the shortcomings of any new system and constantly refine it with the various iterations that we can have.
And I think there's something there around the slip resistance value as an objective as well, because I think people certainly here, now seem to be very paranoid about it's got to be 36 plus, it's got to be 36 plus, but actually in lots of environments, a floor that achieves 30 in the wet is very good, I would suggest, because the floor's not really going to be getting wet very often, as long as you've got other control measures in place. You don't need to be hung up on it being 36 plus necessarily.
Yes, well, we have a situation in Australia where we have a tier of classifications for the pendulum starting at P0 going to P5, and people are determined that they're going to have something that's within one of these classifications, but there's a vast difference in the slip resistance between the top and the bottom of the classification, but negligible difference between the product that's at the bottom of one classification and the top of the one below. So it's what one always needs to be aware of the actual value and where it is within the classification, as well as what it's likely to do in the long term, assuming that it's going to be properly maintained, because that's the other big factor. I mean, we're using 3M's Scotch-Brite pads that have got basically nylon with abrasive in to accelerate the cleaning, and that's very similar to a lot of the cleaning pads that are used on industrial cleaning machines.
Yeah.
So if somebody is using a very heavy pad, they can remove all of the slip resistance, and I've seen it done with some materials a week after opening in a casino, in an external sloping area that's exposed to rain. It had lost all of its slip resistance a week after opening.
Yeah, I've seen that in leisure clubs, for example, where people will, try and clean the floor using like a very abrasive black pad. And the other scenario I see that a lot is in kind of supermarkets and retail, where these kind of diamond pads are very, very popular, but they're effectively polishing the surface and smoothing it down, and therefore making the dry slip resistance significantly higher. And there's a bit of a wool being pulled over people's eyes by some of the people that are making and selling these kinds of pads, by saying that the slip resistance increases, but obviously the wet slip resistance and dry, as you know, are often inversely correlated.
Yes, but I think it just emphasises the point that whenever anybody is specifying the floor, they should also be considering specifying how that floor should be cleaned in order to retain its slip resistance.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of useful information coming from most of the cleaning suppliers. In going to cleaning shows, everybody will say, oh yes, this is slip resistant, based on sometimes ridiculous tests in the dry. They don't know how to recommend, which products and how to be used in order to retain the slip resistance. So there's a vast area of knowledge that's still missing. And I mean, last night I was discussing with somebody the ideas for sessions at the next International Economics Association Congress, and one that was thrown up was the developments in slip resistance over the last 10 to 20 years. And I pointed out that in a paper that's just about to be published in geriatric nursing, where somebody had asked that question, what's changed in the last 40 years? They basically said that the same fundamental causes, whether they relate to the individual or the environment, behaviour, they haven't changed at all, and we knew about them 40 years ago. What we need to be doing is to work out what interventions are necessary and how to put them into place. And while that might be a little bit unfair on some of the academics looking at specific populations and the needs of people with various disabilities or suffering from illnesses, and we know that certain things are going to be beneficial for them. They form a relatively small proportion of the population, and we need to be addressing the larger areas of concern that the general public is exposed to, because if the breadwinner has an accident, then the whole family suffers, the employer suffers, and everybody else.
Yeah.
And it may predispose them to have a long-term injury that's going to diminish their capability to work productively in the long term and to be more susceptible to further falls in the future.
Mm.
So we need to do more, but we don't have anybody undertaking the public good research that people like CSIRO, the Health and Safety Executive, and others. I mean, in America, Liberty Mutual Insurance, everybody has got out of that area. So who is now doing that research?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one, isn't it? And I mean, it's been making, the current situation has been making me think a lot about this, because if you look at the number of people that have a serious enough slip incident or accident, however you want to term it, every year in the UK, and they have to go to A&E, you know, we're in the hundreds of thousands, which is actually significantly more than it seems likely are going to be going to people due to the coronavirus in the UK. And of course, there's going to be a hell of a lot more deaths from the virus than from people slipping and tripping and so on. But, you know, this happens year in and year out, and yet we don't seem to, as you say, have really got to grips with it and done something about it that's sustainable in any way.
I think that it's unfortunate that a lot of the discussion tends to centre on the very elderly who will die far more readily when they have a fall, and there's lots of statistics there, but a lot of people have been seeking to use such data to sensationalise matters and to take things out of context, and we need to focus on the real issues rather than on the distractions that people have engaged in. And while there are tens, hundreds of millions of dollars invested each year in research trying to prevent falls in the elderly, there is virtually nothing being invested in trying to prevent falls in the general population.
I mean, I think just on a personal level, I think that having something more structured around testing and monitoring would be a good first step, because I think right now there are so many building owners and operators that actually wouldn't be able to stand with their hand on their hearts and say, I know the level of friction that my floor gives me in various states of use. And surely just by introducing something where at least every year or 18 months or something they kind of have to do some sort of audit, at least that would give a bit more information that people could start making some informed decisions.
That's very true, but at the same time, the information that is collected by that organisation is their information. The person who is undertaking that on their behalf doesn't have the right to pass that on to everybody else. So we end up with these small pockets of data that end up not being accessible. And one of the wonders of our modern digital world is big data and what we can do with it. So we need to find a way of redacting a lot of those reports and to be able to make use of them. And I think that any building owner, insurance company or anybody else would see the value in contributing to such a scheme. I mean, if it was to be administered by the UK Slip Resistance Group in the UK, there's a time and effort involved in that. Is it going to be a volunteer who puts all of this together, or is it a slight impost on the person collecting the data who does the redaction? And do they charge an extra £1 or £2 to get that material onto the database? But certainly within a country like the UK, that can be done. And I'll be talking to some of my colleagues in Spain further to try and insist that that is done. One can either have the stick or the carrot, and if one talks to the government saying this would be a very good idea, they're likely to use the stick. So can it be done better using the carrot is one of those things we have to work out. But I think that you mentioned slightly before the need to ensure the data that's collected is accurate and the continual improvement of that. We're certainly seeing that in some of the work that the UK Slip Resistance Group has done. At the conference that we had in Madrid 6 weeks ago, or sorry, 6 weeks ago, there was some data indicating an improvement of performance, and certainly some of the work that's being done internationally with the pendulum, with the proficiency studies, we're seeing that we are getting very tight and yielding a lot of improvement there. There's still more that can be done, but we can talk fairly readily between ourselves, that is between Australia and the UK, to a certain extent with Spain, where they're using the pendulum, albeit with a different rubber primarily. Whereas in America, it's hard for them to talk to one another. So we're at least better off, but that's another idea that we have for the next IEA Congress, to review the state of play in various countries from an architect's point of view, as to how reliably they may be able to specify flooring, considering it from a universal design perspective, which is so important, and to be thinking of it from a sustainability perspective, and to ensure the cleanability, which again has got ramifications for sustainability. And just by ensuring the long life cycles, it's again ensuring sustainable materials. So it's it does all tie into modern thinking, and what the United Nations is trying to do. It's just, you know, you've got a couple of individuals trying to push it rather than the big government organisations. And so while I was with CSIRO and, you know, highly respected by everybody in industry, as soon as you lose that position, then you're just somebody else. So I certainly miss that authority. But it would be good to see, you know, people back in government saying this is what we need, and leading from the front. And maybe in countries like Spain, where they now have slip resistance requirements built into their building code, and that requirement is that the whole of the life cycle, then there are flaws in what they have done. Those flaws can be fixed, but they can lead the world as in showing what should be done. So
it'll be very interesting to see as well. You know, you'll need a good period of time for those benefits to come through, but to be able to compare and contrast, you know, the kind of, let's say, the very light touch in America, the sort of slightly firmer touch in the UK, Australia, and the firmer even touch in Spain, and see what that results in terms of incident rates and death rates and all this other stuff. Because obviously, if we did see that Spain was surging ahead of everyone else in terms of performance, then that would G up everyone else to kind of try and get on board with that, hopefully.
That would be good to see. I think that one of the difficulties that we often have is in how data is gathered. And when people fall over, things are often regarded as being a slip or a trip, when it's just a phrase that somebody has used. And the nurse in admissions is going to write that down. So there's a lot of flawed data that governments rely on. And if you look back at the data that authorities such as the Health and Safety Executive may have gathered, you know, I think that they published one bulletin where they gave a bar chart of all of the results, but they didn't break it down by case or anything else like that. So without access to that raw data, you can't really do anything. So I think that there's, so much that should be done, that could be done, but it takes people to talk about it and to sit down and, to do it at a level that people are comfortable with. I know that the bodies that establish building codes, they tend to have an international meeting once or twice every year, and can talk about specific areas. Whether or not they have people of sufficient expertise to talk about issues like slip resistance, or whether they should bring them along and depend on them for those meetings, is another question. But I think that the health and safety authorities should be taking a similar approach at times. But I think that having invested so much in the past, they probably think, well, we've done it all and it's perfect and we don't need to do any more. So, it's a big problem as to how we activate, those powers that can dictate what could or should be done and get them to do it.
Yeah, and the data is really challenging, as you say. We do a lot of work with insurance companies, and when you get sent over these kind of case files, let's say one of them is pitching for a new prospect, and it's a supermarket chain, and they get sent over all of their claims history for the last 5 years or something, and you start analysing the data, and it's all classified as slip triple fall, very few details in there as to what actually happened. So you can't actually build up a picture as to whether they have got a problem with slips, or whether actually they've got a problem with cables on the floor and people tripping over, or whether, it's impossible. And then of course there's this whole near miss piece as well, which as we know, near misses are rarely reported, and certainly not reported in anywhere near the volume that they actually exist. So it's a very, very difficult one. And I think if we were able to nail down the reporting bit, I think the numbers that we all kind of know and report probably would be dwarfed by the reality, and therefore I think that would help to push things on. I mean, there are some interesting things around technology now in terms of apps and things to monitor general health and safety, and I do think that where companies invest in that and kind of buy into that, you do see reporting increasing, and it's probably then becoming more accurate. But I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, but I think that one of the unfortunate aspects of slip resistance is the time and cost of undertaking the testing, and that it's not as readily accessible for somebody to be able to do themselves reliably. That was one of the reasons why I quite liked the Slip Alert when it first came out, in that it is a device that can be used by a large shopping centre to make an instantaneous measurement, and can get some understanding as to how the cleaner might be performing on a weekly basis and are things changing. So that's, from a litigious perspective, when you're called out and you can see, looking at the surroundings in external areas from Google Earth and things like that, that they've completely remodeled the whole thing since the accident occurred.
Yeah.
And when you are due to come out, the floor's just been cleaned, and the data that anybody can obtain is often suspect at best. And certainly in Australia, one of the big advantages compared to America is that our primary duty is, or paramount duty is, to the court, to inform them without fear or favour and without favouring either party. Whereas in empirically applied, but yeah, to be put into a situation where people often expect you to be able to hypothesize as to how an accident actually did occur. I mean, you can develop that in your own mind, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other scenarios that are equally probable or possible. So it's yeah, one of those things. How does the shopping centre manager get that data? I think that they need to, if they don't have anything themselves, they need to have that auditing done. But for the audits to be done almost at a random time, so that they may not be expecting it, and you can be making measurements on the floor as found, and then after the normal cleaning, and then if you want to do a specialist clean afterwards, you can do that and show the difference.
Yeah.
But certainly from the litigious point of view, the floor has often just had a special clean before you get there.
Yeah.
And you can often determine that. I mean, I'll often go there a couple of days beforehand and have a look at the floor, and that if you are in your own home city, you can certainly do that. If you're going to Vanuatu or assessing claims there, then they don't pay for you generally to arrive a week early.
No, which is a shame, because that would be rather nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But they don't want you to leave too early, because they want you to do a good job and to ensure you do it properly while you're there.
Yes, of course. No, absolutely. Yeah, same principle here in terms of expert witness stuff. Your duty is to the court, so it has to be impartial and independent, and yeah, give an opinion. But as you say, sometimes it's very difficult to give much of certainty around that. You can only judge things on what you've seen and your experience, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be absolutely right. Is there anything you've seen that you mentioned the slip alert, and I recommend the slip alert to clients of mine to do monitoring testing as well. People like cruise ships and shopping centres and things like that, where actually getting a pendulum test done very, very frequently just isn't economically viable or feasible. I've often thought there must be a way of doing something with an iPhone or something like that. I don't know if we could figure out a way of measuring roughness of a surface with an iPhone, or I don't know, something simple that would just be not an absolute gold standard measure, but just something that would give a bit of an idea. Have you heard of anything coming along in terms of technology that might be exciting like that?
No, I think that roughness really needs to be done from a three-dimensional perspective. And in looking at the work that Marcel Engels has done in Germany, looking at how the roughness changes, it can change very, very slightly. And he's got some interesting diagrams that he shows at times, but the change is so subtle that you can have a significant move in the slip resistance. When you start putting it onto a triaxial diagram, it makes life very, very difficult. I mean, it is so complex. So I don't know that there's a simple way of doing that, and certainly using RA, RZ and things like that is not the way to go. I think that it can give you maybe an indication that might be right a certain percentage of the time, but some of the work that Wenrui Chang did, looking at the correlation between slip resistance, and I'd have to think which device he was using for that, with surface roughness parameters, you would have 2 or 3 parameters that were giving better correlation with one tile, looking at another tile, it was different parameters, looking at another one again, it was different parameters. In looking at process control of products, on the production line, you basically need to scan and to work out a line of best fit and to ensure that you're not deviating from that. So you're taking in all of the aspects of roughness, and if there is a significant deviation, you can work out that you're likely or unlikely to be where you want to be. But I think it's too complex, and the assumptions that we make when we slip resistance testing are large enough without extrapolating any further.
Yeah, it's a shame, isn't it? Because I think that would, if there was a way of doing something that was as simple as using it on a phone, I'm sure that would help our cause to get more people engaged in this and try and solve this problem, because it is frustrating as somebody who has been trying to help solve the problem for 10 years and yourself for even longer, that if you look at it, accidents and incidents as a proportion of everything, slips and trips and falls as a proportion of everything else is broadly static. So it's all of our hard work, we are having successes in some places, but looking at the big picture, it's still the same as it ever was. It's frustrating to say the least.
Well, in going to one of the American forensic science conferences one year, I went to several of the exhibitors and asked them, did they have anything for measuring the cleanliness of floors? And they all wanted to help me if I was interested in blood. But when it came to assessing the cleanliness of floors, there are a couple of devices that can be looking for specific things, but it's not general cleanliness as we would know it. So we may have greater success if we are looking to use a phone, maybe with some compounds that may radiate or iridesce or whatever and show up readily under some form of filter. But I think that the change in roughness is very hard to pick up, even using very sophisticated electro-optic equipment. And even there, the equipment manufactured by different people is going to give you different measures of the roughness. So it's hard for people with different pieces of equipment to communicate with one another as to what the actual results mean.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something around the cleanliness, because my view is that in the newer buildings nowadays, as I kind of said earlier, the architects and the specifiers are getting better at putting in the right kinds of floors in the right kinds of environments, broadly speaking, and therefore where we are getting issues, it tends to be around the cleaning and maintenance. Of course, there's a huge raft of older buildings where floors were specified without too much regard for slip resistance many years ago. But I think in the newer buildings, that's got to be a good way of going. That we've been experimenting with. It's a little spray, and you just spray it on. It works in a similar way as an ATP test to measure the level of microorganisms, but it's just a spray on, and depending on how much it changes colour, it gives you a good idea. And I mean, we've not done enough tests by any means to give a scientific answer on this, but there does appear to be quite a good correlation between the result of that test and what you're likely to get on a pendulum test.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things that we need to do is to come up with smart ideas and to then be shopping them around to some of the academics who have got the students there that might find it a fascinating project. I mean, a lot of work on cleanability was done in Quebec and with Francois Quirillon. You're probably familiar with his work. But I guess we have these pockets of research that are done maybe over a 5-10 year period, and then somebody moves on to another field, and once you are familiar with it, you tend not to forget it, but somebody else coming along trying to find reports that were published in-house and very little being published in the open literature, which is expensive to get a lot of the time, so isn't widely accessed. And so I think the part of the problem with preventing falls is the massive spread of technical journals that you can find papers published in, whether they be related to a particular material such as a ceramic tile, in a tile journal, or in a building journal, or in a forensic science journal, economics. I mean, there are so many that it makes it very hard to find at all. So,
And I think as well, it's about the accessibility of it from the perspective of who do we need to be reading this and taking it in, and are those papers presented in such a way that that person or those people are likely to A, want to read it, and B, be able to understand it and do something about it. And I think there's it's the same with any kind of academic endeavor, but there's always something around how do you present it and pitch it, for want of a better term, that it can be disseminated more widely. So I'm sure there's something that could be done on that as well.
I think that one of the best examples of that would be a checklist. If I write a checklist, I know exactly why I'm writing it and what I'm going to be looking for. Anybody else who reads my checklist won't know exactly what I was thinking about, and they will interpret it in their own way. We see the same checklists being used by so many safety authorities throughout the world that, in my opinion, are rarely used intelligently or to the maximum potential. And people just tick yes, they don't even put anything down half the time. So it's, explaining why something is being done that's often so fundamentally important. So the training of people and the number of people who learn their profession almost from reading a standard and trying to test to it, and then reading guidance associated with the standard, and that becomes the Bible. And quite often that guidance has not been properly expressed, and it can be, an example would be when we went from using the 400p paper for preparing rubber sliders for the pendulum test and went to pink lapping film, some of the correlations that we had developed were quite useful for providing guidance. As soon as we started using the lapping film and some of the results changed significantly, that correlation was no longer available and significant, and so the traditional guidance was no longer applicable. But people don't know that.
No.
So they don't know what they don't know. The difficulty is that you've got to go back and look at things and say, no, that's no longer correct. And so that's not done often enough. And I wrote to somebody on a completely different subject in America 2 weeks ago, and I'm still waiting for a response because they're, the big authority, but they haven't covered everything in their technical literature in a correct manner. I mean, there are things that are now industry practice that I think are wrong, that they say are wrong, but they're still being done despite their guidance. So, are they going to live up to what they're saying? I mean, how are they going to react? They're still making their mind up before they get back to me.
I suppose there have been a few things going on in the last couple of weeks, I suppose, in the world. So I guess maybe they've got their minds on other things.
Yeah, but my attitude is I can't do anything about that. I can keep myself safe.
Yeah.
I can keep my mind busy.
Yeah.
And why worry about things I can't control? So the things I can control, I may as well put my mind to and be active there. And, what's going to happen outside these four walls is going to happen. I hope it's going to be for the very best.
Yes.
And people maximise the opportunity that they have to plan and to do other things, while they are home incarcerated or hibernating or quarantined or however we want to put it. But
convalescing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you can do Zoom interviews across the world like we're doing, and make a positive use of your time.
Yeah, well, definitely, and yeah, be making plans for the future.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think actually the coronavirus crisis will there's a good chance that it will positively impact our world of slips and trips, because I do feel as if on the other side of this, people are going to have a higher expectation around cleanliness, and therefore that will help in those scenarios, as we've said, that the floor surfaces are pretty good, but they haven't historically been maintained that well, and people have kind of been accepting of a certain level of brand standards, let's say. When I think people will actually want more and expect more now, so hopefully that will make a difference to us as well.
Well, I hope that's the case, but people tend to have very short memories, and in a brave new world, they'll often fall into other ways of doing things, whether it be digital or whatever. I mean, there's going to be a lot of hybridization of meetings and events, and they're going to change tremendously. And the way in which a lot of not-for-profit organizations are run, I think that's going to change significantly. And we're going to have to evolve and be more creative. And I think that the way in which software evolves and things like that, again, is going to change how we operate. But people are always going to be looking for simple solutions. And unless we can really make things simple for them, it's unlikely that they're going to readily adopt it. I mean, they'll adopt things that are cheaper, that they can disregard. But as soon as people have to apply themselves, which is one of the requirements when it comes to preventing incidents from occurring, then they don't want to have to do that. I mean, the architect wants to be able to copy and paste specifications if they can without having to look at specific circumstances. They don't want to have to become an expert in this as well as everything else. So I think that if I had a lot of money to invest, I might go to a stockbroker and ask for specific advice. I think that some of the architects should be seeking specific advice on slip prevention matters and universal access matters and things like that to ensure that what they're doing is correct. And it doesn't need to be a large cost. And in thinking of people at the moment who are trying to work with the not-for-profit organisations and the people who like to sponsor them, he's sitting there in the middle saying, okay, I can do this for you and I can do this for you. It's a win-win situation for him. Mm. And I think it can be a similar situation if we had slip brokers, helping the architect on one hand and helping the product suppliers on another, to be able to do better business one to the other and to ensure that everybody's getting what they need in the first place, because it makes the building owner happier in the end. And we've seen so many problems in Australia with the quality value type judgments where people will try and substitute other products in that place those that have been specified. And we've seen instances of building owners saying, this is the product I want because of its look. And then they'll find that its slip resistance is not quite what might be recommended. And then they'll say, no, yeah, you've not given me this. And they'll then try and hit the builder for having imported it without checking the quality. And it's just that little bit off. Mm. And there's some very nasty games being played at times when it's not really important, because whether it's just over a line or underneath it, it's going to lose difference, and it's doesn't make any difference in the long term.
Yeah. I think this whole complexity is something that is a real challenge, because if you take, I don't know, a supermarket, you know, they work as do many big companies in these silos. So you've got somebody who's designing a store for the aesthetic, and as long as their project cost is X, they're okay. And you've got somebody in FM who's delivering it, and they're going to try and save a bit of money here. As you say, they might substitute something or whatever it might be. And you've got somebody else looking after cleaning, and they're going to try and cut their costs and make their P&L look good. And then someone else looking after insurance and claims. And actually bringing them all together is the trick here. And I think one of the challenges that we have is people um, people still perceive these accidents as kind of not that serious or a bit humorous, or even from a building owner perspective, oh, it's easy, we just put a yellow sign out, or we just have to clean the floor, and they think it's just kind of click their fingers and it's as simple as that. And actually what hopefully people are getting out of this conversation and others that I'll be having as well is that it's a very complicated subject, and you do need some deep thought and partnership approach to try and solve it.
Yes, I was on our Australian National Occupational Health and National Occupational Health and Safety Commission, their Research Advisory Committee, and the person who was running that, he had held a conference where he had the CEOs of some large companies come up and address the audience. And in each case, there had been a fatality in that business. And he had them tell the audience what it feels like to have to apologise to the household for having had that fatality. So it is a very serious area. And when you have to investigate accidents where people have died and become quadriplegics and things like that, it really comes back to you. When you have people suicide because they believe that they're going to lose the court case because somebody has given them the wrong information and tried to scare them into settling, it really comes, it hits you hard. But this is, a quality of life issue, not just for the people directly involved or the person who's had the incident, but for the families as well. It just goes on and on. So we've got a huge responsibility.
Are you seeing anything interesting that's happening in the world from in this little niche that might be moving things in the right direction, or do you think it's kind of we've got to keep on hammering home these messages that we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes or so?
I think that the most exciting thing from the area that I'm closely involved in would be the accelerated wear conditioning and the close correlation that they've obtained in Spain between people walking, where you can have, I think in one instance, they've got 350,000 people who've walked on a floor, and they've monitored the loss of slip resistance over time. And at the time of the results, they'd had around about 280,000 people, and the slip resistance with slider 57 had decreased from 50 down to 28, I would say. And with the accelerated wear conditioning, they had a curve that was totally coincident with that. And with the method that they had used there, that was based on what we had developed in Australia, they had got to 28 cycles, or at 30 cycles, the two lines were coincident. And again, at 20 cycles, they were coincident. So they only made measurements at 20 and 30. But in interim points of 220,000 people and 280,000 people, they were right on the same line. So I think that where we can get that very good prediction, then we can be looking and saying, okay, by the time we get to 400,000 people, we're likely to have a value 25 ppm. So why on earth will we relying on the value of 50 for specification purposes? And where we see these curves crossing and some descending far more rapidly than others, it's the ones that have got the slip resistance at the end that I'm more interested in, and the ones that have lost the least slip resistance, so that I know that in the areas that are heavily trafficked and those that are lightly trafficked, there's not going to be that significant a difference in the slip resistance, as with some of the other areas where the heavily trafficked area, where somebody suddenly walks on it from a less trafficked area, and if it's all wet, you're used to it being safe, and then suddenly it's not. So I think that that's very, very exciting, and it does give us a better reason to go back to what we had 20, 30 years ago, where a lot of people would declare a value of polished slip resistance value, saying this is as slippery as this floor should get. So I think that we can certainly go back to that. And for some of the products that are harder to predict, they can maybe rely on some of their intellectual property rather than on specific testing to declare these values. So I think that the basis for specification can certainly be improved. If people want to continue specifying the same way they are now, they can do that, even if there's a greater risk associated with it. But at some stage in the future, people are going to say, no, there's too much risk associated with that for this material. I'm going to swap over and do it this way. Even if there's a slightly greater cost in getting that more reliable data.
Yeah. It'll just take, one or two incidents and civil or criminal cases, and that's what will happen, I'm sure, because the architects certainly seem to be pretty risk averse from what I see anyway. So I suspect they will go that way, and I think, as you say, that's got to be a good thing, because even those numbers, 280,000 people, 300,000 people, yeah, that's a lot of people, but in lots of buildings, train stations and airports, it's not really that many people at all, if you think about how many people are going to be going through there every single day, year after year after year.
That's right. And I think that the words that the barristers often use, wouldn't it have been foreseeable? Just that simple question, and you have to say yes. So if something's foreseeable and you don't do it, when people are saying, this is a valid option, then, you're right in the firing line.
I was talking to somebody about the use of the word accident, actually, and he made the point that we shouldn't call them accidents, we should call them incidents, because an accident is not foreseeable, whereas actually 99% of these issues that we're talking about are foreseeable, and therefore we should call them incidents instead, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it.
Well, I think that when you play this back, you're probably going to see that at times I have almost said accident and I have said incident.
Yeah, I've been trying to stop myself since that conversation, but I haven't quite managed yet. I think I'm going to write a nice long article about the difference, and then that will ingrain it into my brain. Anything that we haven't touched on that you want to just elaborate on at all for the audience before we start wrapping it up?
Nothing that immediately comes to mind. It's normally the case that in 5 minutes' time.
Yeah, I should have talked about that. Well, we can always arrange another conversation. I'm sure I know there's a lot more we could be talking about anyway. So before we finish, then, Richard, do you want to just give people your contact details, web addresses, or anything like that, in case they want to get in touch with you for any reason?
Yep, certainly. The easiest way of contacting me would be on email. It's easy to remember, slipbusters@gmail.com. So one young lady a friend's girlfriend actually came up to me and he said, "Why do you do that to girls' slips? You know, rend them, tear them, you know." So that may help people to just remember Slipbusters.
Oh, there you go. We've now got all sorts of images going through our mind. Great. Well, Richard, thank you very much. I know it's late there, so I'm going to let you retire. It doesn't look it in the background, but it is late, so I'll let you head off to bed. But thanks very much for sharing some time with us today.
My pleasure, Christian, anytime.
Cheers.